Welcome back, everyone. Hope you've had a nice little break there. It's moving on now to our next speaker, who is Kat Husbands. Kat's going to be talking about imposter syndrome in user-centered design. She's a researcher with a background in content design and information architecture. She currently works for the Scottish Government's in-house design team, and she also co-hosts the UX Glasgow meetup. So it's a bit of kind of local UX kind of collaboration here, which is so it's lovely to be able to invite her to talk today. So over to you, Kat.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. As Stu says, I'm dialing in from Glasgow, where I'm a user researcher for the Scottish Government. As such, as a civil servant, I'm required to tell you that the talk I'm giving today has nothing to do with my role. I'm here as a private individual. I'm going to be sharing with you my findings from a wee survey that I ran and analysed in my own time, because that's my idea of fun. I will be sharing these slides in Slack later if anybody wants to have them, so you don't need to do screenshots or whatever. Today I'm going to be talking about what is imposter syndrome. I'm going to talk about how you might compare to the people that responded to my survey. That's going to be a couple of Slido polls, same as Flo just did in his talk. So if you want to take part in that, get your mobile phone ready or open another browser window for that. And then the main part of the talk is going to be all the tips that we got from the survey respondents on ways to beat imposter syndrome, ways to combat the pain points of that experience. And then there'll be a wee bit of time at the end for questions, which you can post on the YouTube Slack or on YouTube chat or on Slack. So what is imposter syndrome? I think of it as an example of the terrible user experience of the human mind. It is a form of low self-esteem where you doubt your abilities despite your success. You have an inner critic who won't let you internalize your achievements or take any satisfaction from them. So even if people are telling you, all around you, they're telling you how successful you are, how great you are, how much they appreciate your work, you might think that you must have fooled them somehow, and it's only a matter of time before they find you out. It's a lot of fear and anxiety clogging up your brain. It can take up so much brain space that it can hold you back from things, hold you back from being creative, from being curious, from being brilliant. It is an internal experience. It's all in your head. If you find that you're being treated like an imposter, that's a whole different issue. You need to speak to HR. You need to get away from that person. But this internal experience, to me, it sucks all the pleasure out of a job well done. I have struggled with it at times. I'm doing okay right now, but I have struggled with it a lot in the past. It has, in fact, nearly stopped me from taking this secondment that led to my career change into user-centered design. I was offered a secondment. I thought, oh, I couldn't do that. I couldn't possibly. And it took a really good manager saying, you're already doing it. Take the secondment. And now here I am. So imposter syndrome nearly stopped me in that. And I think it does stop some other people. If none of those feelings sound familiar to you, then lucky you. This quote is for you. This is from Dr. Valerie Young, who wrote one of the best books about imposter syndrome, The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women. Pretend it just says successful people. It's not specifically about women. It's just people in general. Whether you experience these feelings or not, male or female, if you lead, teach, mentor, manage, or parent other people, you need to understand imposter syndrome. So do you know someone who maybe can't accept praise? They deflect compliments. They maybe perform well, but don't seem like they enjoy their success. Someone that's maybe always down on themselves. It could be that they're experiencing imposter syndrome. So the things that I'm talking about today, if they're not useful to you, you might be able to pass them on to someone else. So time for the first poll. I would like to know if you have experienced imposter syndrome. I'm going to look away at my other screen because that's where the poll sits. I'm still here. Please go to slido.com and enter the code UXBKAT and let me know if you've experienced imposter syndrome, either yourself now or in the past, or if you know someone else who you think has it, or if you're one of the lucky people that's able to tick no. Just while that's going on, I can tell you that an article in the International Journal of Behavioural Science has estimated that 70% of people will experience feelings of imposter syndrome at some point in their life. And in the survey that I carried out, 94% of the respondents said that they have experienced it, or they're having it now, or they've had it in the past. I will point out that that was a survey specifically about imposter syndrome, so people weren't likely to take it if they weren't able to relate to it, but still 94%, wow. And from you guys, it seems 75% of you are experiencing it now, 40 have had it in the past, coming up for about 30 know someone else who's had it, and nobody has ticked no. Whew, amazing. Okay, thank you for that. Our first big takeaway from this talk then is it's not just you. You can do a quick Google search for imposter syndrome famous people, and you'll see dozens and dozens of politicians, scientists, writers, authors, celebrities who experience it. We have a couple of quotes from the survey. Whenever you see speech bubbles like this is the words of the people that answered the survey. So we had someone saying, I opened it up to my colleagues and found that all of them felt exactly the same. We were all comparing ourselves to each other and suffering in silence. That's just a little bit of silence for you there. So yeah, all the quotes in speech bubbles are mostly from members of the UX Glasgow meetup group, which, as Stu mentioned, I'm one of the co-hosts of. This used to be in real life meetup in pubs, if you remember pubs. We do little paper sign-in sheets, we pass them around. It would all be very, very sweet and adorable. Obviously, since April, we've been doing this instead. Hi, but at least we can still do sign-in sheets using Zoom whiteboard. This is the first one we ever did. It was quite spectacular with dinosaurs and dogs, and yeah, we've been trying to do that as much as we can just to keep the community feel together. So on screen just now are some of the 100 lovely people who filled in my survey and whose experiences and advice I'm going to share with you today. I wanted you to see their faces so you know that there are real people, people like you, behind every data point that we're going to show here. The survey itself was something that I kind of threw together at the last minute to inform a discussion we were having in UX Glasgow for an evening focusing on mental health at the start of this year. It was just 6 questions, quite a short survey, but ended up being a really, really lively discussion. That was a lot of fun. And the range of advice that we got from these people was just fabulous. So I spent some time mucking about with spreadsheets and charts, and I wrote it up into a blog post. Doing that is actually what got me through the long, dark month of February, which was awful up here. And all of it's led to this talk. So here we are today. Now let's look at some of the data from the survey. The people that responded to it, we had which field do you work in, or fields. You can select all that apply. So there's quite a range of things. Probably a bias towards user researchers because I'm a user researcher, and obviously I punted it out on Twitter. So, lots of user researchers that follow me and that I follow will have done the survey. But there was still an interesting mix of different roles and people at different levels in their career as well. We got quite a good spread. A quick disclaimer before we start talking in percentages. This is not statistics. This is, I made no attempt to get a representative sample here. I'm not extrapolating anything. I'm just going to report on what this particular group of 100 people said. That's just my user researcher disclaimer. Thank you. We had one tip from a survey respondent who said that be aware that everyone at every level seems to have imposter syndrome to some degree. And the data from the surveys back this up. As you can see, nobody at all said that they never experienced imposter syndrome. As I say, it was a survey about that, but anyway, it's still pretty telling. A very high percentage of people at mid-level in their career, junior and mid-level in their career, have imposter syndrome right now. Less so at the senior level and director level, but they've still had it in the past. So it's kind of the suggestion that seniority probably doesn't stop us from feeling like we're going to get caught at any minute, but there is maybe some hope that we can learn how to deal with it over time. So another question I asked in the survey is about the 5 types of imposter. We're going to do another poll here. This is something that came up in my reading. Dr. Valerie Young, the author of the book that I mentioned earlier on, she came up with these 5 types. They describe our perceptions of ourselves and our expectations of ourselves. They're not how we want other people to see us. They're what our terrible UX minds think that we should actually be. So if you have a read through them here and let me know in the poll again what type of imposter you think you might be, or combination of them. The perfectionist, you set impossibly high standards for yourself and beat yourself up when you don't reach them. That's me. The expert, you expect to know everything and feel ashamed when you don't. That used to be me, but I've broken that one. I'll tell you how later. The soloist, you believe that work should be accomplished alone and refuse to take credit if you received any kind of help. The natural genius, you feel everything must be handled with ease, otherwise it's not natural talent. And the superhero, you tell yourself you should be able to excel at every role you take on in your life. I was a bit like that when I was younger, but thankfully that went away. Let's have a wee look at the results here. Okay, we have a lot of experts, perfectionists, we have superheroes, about a third, natural genius, and soloist a bit lower. Okay, I'll give that a couple more seconds for it to settle. Just remember, this is the way you think about yourself and what you think you should actually be. Cool. That's actually looking very similar to the survey. That's really interesting. I'm going to close that one now, so thank you. The imposter types that the respondents in the survey identified with the most were perfectionist and expert, with quite a strong showing of superheroes as well. The low number of soloists I quite like to see, and it happened again in the poll just there. I think that actually fits really nicely with the idea of user-centered design being a team sport. So even if we believe that we have to be perfect and experts, we don't think that we have to do everything alone. We know that we're meant to work together. That makes me smile. This was a multiple choice question when I did it in the survey as well. So here's a quick idea of the overlaps that we had between different types. I also did a breakdown, which I'm not going to have time to show, but I will share later on, of the types by field. So in which field do the types have prominence? So for example, we found that service designers identified as natural geniuses a lot more than the average. Product designers identified as perfectionists a lot more than the average. A couple more things like that, quite interesting. But yeah, that will be available later in the data that I'm going to share on Slack. So that's enough data. Let's get to the good stuff. The tips on how to beat imposter syndrome. 43 out of 100 people had tips that they wanted to give. Many of the tips apply sort of to mental health in general, to resilience in general. So while I'm going to list them all on the screen, I'm only going to talk about the ones that I think are the most relevant to the specific pain points of imposter syndrome. We broke these tips down into 4 themes, starting with recognize it in the first place. 23 people had advice on this. Obviously, you need to learn about it. You're at this talk, well done, you're learning about it. Talking about your feelings is just a huge, huge benefit with any kind of mental health problem. It helps you to pick them apart and to recognize that they're not unusual. The key one in this theme is to accept and forgive yourself. So as with any mental health problem, once you know what is going on, you must treat yourself gently. Imposter syndrome is your inner critic beating you up. And the only thing worse than beating yourself up is beating yourself up for beating yourself up. So don't go, oh no, I'm stupid, I've got imposter syndrome. Nah, you need to be self-compassionate. You need to develop your honesty and self-acceptance and learn to forgive yourself. You can talk to yourself as a friend would. You can recognize that the pressure you're putting yourself is ridiculous and so on. So that's the first one there. Let's move on to the theme of dealing with it in the moment. 16 people had tips here. The mention of a kind of methods that might form your self-care toolkit, things like breathing exercises, grounding exercises, self-talk that you can use when you're in the moment of experiencing imposter syndrome and finding it shutting you down or freezing you up. If you don't yet have a self-care toolkit, you'll find a million suggestions online, especially since COVID. I suggest you just see what's around, try something out, start small, iterate, see what works. My personal tip for this is meditation, mindful meditation. Do it regularly so that it helps you get used to stepping back from your thoughts and feelings, so that when your inner critic does start up, you can catch yourself quickly and stop the downward spiral, step away from it, see what's triggering it, move away. Anyway, the most important part in dealing with it in the moment is about confessing your weaknesses. A couple of people had things to say about this. This one's especially, I think, valuable if you're an expert or a superhero imposter type. Letting yourself be vulnerable, however uncomfortable it feels, and be honest about what you do and don't know. Not only does it build other people's trust in you, it helps you to build your own understanding of what other people expect from you, which is likely to be more realistic than your own expectations of yourself. The final point here was the good old feel the fear and do it anyway. There was actually a nice quote along those lines: avoid the rabbit in headlights hiatus by just starting to do it. Break the fear of self-doubt. That's a good one. I'm going to come on to dealing with it in the medium term. 33 people had tips on this one. We had various ways that you can develop a habit of conscious self-reflection, journaling, personal retro, ways to develop your self-awareness. Again, it helps you build your resilience. Finding a supportive team, that's kind of self-explanatory. Obviously, if you work alone or with an unsupportive team, you're more likely to feel feelings of imposter syndrome, from my personal experience. The really good one in here is about asking for feedback, especially if you're a perfectionist. Externalize your focus, put the focus onto your work instead of your abilities, and ask your colleagues what they think. Ask what they think you should stop, start, and continue doing. Again, the kind of personal retro kind of format. And get it out of your head. Start to look at other people's expectations rather than your own. Also, in dealing with it medium term, is focusing on the positive. I think this is great for all the different imposter types. If you've ever had some sort of particularly positive feedback, save it somewhere, go back to it often. I had an old boss who called this kind of thing herograms. There's no connection to the superhero imposter type, it's just herograms as a cool word. So I've now got a herogram folder in my Outlook where I stash away emails where people have said nice things about me, and I can go back and look at it when I'm feeling glum. Send herograms to tell people that you appreciate their work. It's such a valuable thing that you can give to other people. To remind yourself that no one sees you the way that you see yourself. And there was actually a tip that it's great to remind yourself what you've done. Updating your CV is a great hack for this and useful to do anyway. Excuse me, I'm going to have another swig. The next one in the dealing with imposter syndrome in the medium term is to think about ways that you can turn your weaknesses into strengths. I think you need to be quite cautious with this one so that you don't end up justifying your inner critic. But it's kind of worth thinking that maybe the imposter types are good things taken to extremes. So maybe you can dial it back and come up with a strength. For example, it's good to hold yourself to high standards, but perfectionism is obviously a step too far. It's good to be kind of T-shaped, to have a broad skill set, like a kind of a superhero, with one or two areas of expertise, but recognize that no one can know everything, no one can do everything. Be realistic. And overall, it's possibly better to be humble than arrogant in your work. You're going to be more open to growth and to learning if you're at least a little humble. Going to come on to beating imposter syndrome for good. I've put a question mark here because who knows? I'm not going to promise anything. It could still come back. But with all these tips and so on, we've got ways that you can be ready for it, ways for you to minimize its impact. So 12 people spoke about ways you can beat imposter syndrome for good, or things that have worked for them. The discussion that we had was kind of looking at how some mental health problems are caused by chemical balances or external stresses, whereas others, like imposter syndrome and different forms of anxiety, these are caused by having faulty core beliefs right in your core. So this is like the basic programming of our minds, our beliefs about ourselves and about the world that we hold deeply in our subconscious. We're maybe not even aware of it. These core beliefs, they develop early in our lives or early in our careers based on how we're treated, what we see happening around us, the influence of people who make a strong impression of us, and so on. So a core belief, a subconsciously held core belief might be, I'm only valuable if I'm perfect, or if I need help, I'm a failure. So the key is to dig out and change those core beliefs. Depending on how each one was formed and how long you've held it, this could take quite a lot of hard work in therapy. I would recommend going for MVP here, minimum viable psychotherapy, starting with kind of self-work, inner critic worksheets. You might have an informal counselling service at your work or even a formal one. There's obviously cognitive behavioural therapy, which is where you kind of use logic and rationale to challenge your emotions and challenge your assumptions. And acceptance and commitment therapy is one that I've recently found out about and would very much like to try, which is more kind of mindful and based on defining your values and making sure that you have ways to live by your values and not by maybe your faulty core beliefs. So yeah, there's potentially a lot of work there. Or you could get really lucky and just realize that you had the wrong idea about something and update that idea. I mentioned earlier that I used to be the expert imposter type, but in 2017, this single image cured me of that by updating my belief about how knowledge works within teams. I used to think everyone else knows everything. I only know a little bit. I need to know everything. Obviously, that's not the case. Within a team, you have people that know different things. It all kind of shares about and evens out. And that was just a very simple fix to that one. So I no longer have the expert imposter type. But you do need to be open to having your mind changed when you see something like this. If you're open to it, then that's a great start in improving the UX of your mind. I'm going to come on to another thing under beating imposter syndrome for good is to learn to accept praise. I was delighted when this one came up in the survey because it's something that I have very consciously taught myself to do, even though it's not very Scottish or perhaps even not very British to do. I'm writing a blog post about this, which I will post in the Slack group and on the Twitter later. But in the meantime, it boils down to, at beginner level, receive a compliment to say thank you. Don't say, oh, well, it wasn't really me, it was someone else. Oh, well, it wasn't that good. Just say thank you. Intermediate level is thank you. I'm glad that the work that I did has been valuable to you and that you appreciate it. You echo back the details of the praise, even if you don't possibly believe them. You can kind of fake it until you feel it, perhaps. And at advanced level is thank you. Could you put that in writing, please? Build up your collection of herograms. You could get LinkedIn recommendations, that kind of thing. That's quite advanced technique. I rarely manage that one, but I'd like to try. The very last thing I'm going to talk to you about here is this awesome idea of choosing to fail. Consciously deciding to be bad at something and embrace it. This is the thing that got the most chat at UX Glasgow. It was a brilliant one. It kind of speaks to the agile way of working as well, that you can iterate, you can see your work as experiments and know that not everything is going to work, but it's interesting to learn why. Try something and fix something is better than getting paralyzed by overthinking or overplanning. I absolutely love this idea. And on thinking about it, I realized that without meaning to, I have chosen to fail at cake decorating. I love baking. I'm quite good at making things that taste good, but I absolutely no skill at all in making things look good. And I've decided to just embrace that. I'm fine with it. I'm going to keep making ugly, ugly cakes and enjoy eating them. So that is me choosing to fail. And here is our last poll. We've got maybe 10 things listed there that I think were the best tips specifically about beating imposter syndrome. So have a quick read through. Let me know which ones you think you might be able to try. Obviously, all the general tips for mental health and resilience and well-being also count, but I think these are the key ones for imposter syndrome. So let's see what you're thinking in the poll. Choose to fail. It's great fun. I've actually set up a Slack channel for imposter syndrome, so perhaps later on we can meet in there, talk about ways that we can choose to fail, talk about our experiences of imposter syndrome. I think it's a really valuable thing to talk about and share with other people. So maybe I'll see you in Slack later on. And thank you for listening. This is great. I think I'm going to close the poll. I'm running out of time here, but thank you very much for taking part. Before I share the slides, I'm going to capture the actual results of the poll to chuck in there so that you can see that when you're looking back. But whatever you are going to try, start small, review and iterate, see what works for you. Do use the design to it. So that's the end of my talk. That was my offering from UX Glasgow to UX Bristol with love. And if this talk has maybe given you the idea that you might have imposter syndrome and you didn't know that before, please be kind to yourself, show self-compassion, and you'll be good. I think that's me. Any questions?
Thanks so much, Kat. That's a fantastic talk, and I think lots for all of us watching to think about, and think about how we can address some of those issues. Just brilliant stuff. We do have some questions that have come in. Jay Spanton got in there very early this morning with a question, and he asked, is there a big difference in imposter feelings between self-taught UCD folks and those who've formally qualified, who maybe have degrees, PhDs, masters or so on? Or did you have any evidence from that, from your discussions and research before?
I actually don't. I think that was a really good question that he's asked in Slack. I saw that earlier on. That's not a question I asked in the survey, and I really wish it had been. So maybe that's something we can talk about in the Slack channel this afternoon. I'll certainly look out for in discussions in the future.
Well, it certainly resonated with me as from an academic background, moving to a different discipline, doing user-centered design. In that, I would say that I'm less confident in speaking about what I know about compared to the formal qualifications. So that's sort of anecdotal evidence, but I think there may be something in there. It'd be interesting to find out more.
Really, yep.
Brilliant. Another question here from James. I guess it's kind of teasing it apart in terms of, do you have a sense of any other dimension about kind of public or private sector? What are the things? I don't know if you've done any of this kind of breaking it down.
Again, that's a question that I'd love to ask if I decide to do this survey again, which I'm feeling more and more inclined to do. From my personal experience, I find that people in the private sector tend to be more self-confident. I generally worked in the public sector and experienced a lot of imposter syndrome all around in all different types of teams. But then when I've worked with people in the public sector, private sector, maybe they're just better at coming across as confident. I don't know. But yeah, again, that's something I'd be really interested to find out more about myself.
Yeah, do you think the culture in the public sector is maybe more open to allowing people to be more kind of vulnerable about their feelings and concerns than in the private sector? And it's kind of very broad generalizations, but again, there's a massive research project here, isn't there?
It really is, yeah. And I think I'm going to have to take it on.
Fantastic. Are there any mental health resources that you could share with us, perhaps in Slack, that will be useful for people if they want to take this further?
Absolutely, yeah. I've got a whole bunch of links that I had on the final slide there, which I'll chuck into the Slack, and then a couple of more articles and stuff that have been really useful to me. The best one is a kind of flow chart that resume.io produced, which helps you to identify your imposter type, and then it has type-specific tips at the bottom. So I'm definitely going to link to that. That'll be a good one. There's also some really good podcasts that I've listened to as well. Squiggly Careers, their podcast on imposter syndrome was excellent. And yeah, I've got some links to some very good self-help resources specifically about how to combat your inner critic. So that's a good one.
Fantastic. And another question around COVID. Obviously, COVID has had a massive impact on mental health. Have you any sense of whether that feeds into imposter syndrome, or is it just more of a kind of a broad brush of potential doom and gloom?
That's a hell of a broad brush, yeah. I mean, I can only talk about my personal experience of people I know, but certainly a lot of the younger members of UX Glasgow. It was one of our youngest members who actually requested that we do an event on mental health and specifically imposter syndrome, and that was suggested in December, and we did it in January. And I think there's certainly a lot of extra struggle for people who are trying to break into UX or trying to just get their career off the ground in the first place. That everything's remote, everything's working from home. You're not able to quickly go out and go network and meet people. Yeah, I do think COVID has had an impact on that, certainly.
Yeah. And just kind of final sort of area for discussion. Just thinking about how imposter syndrome applies specifically to design. So I think there's some things which are unique to design, which is, first of all, design is constraints are something that are fundamental to design. You don't get this infinite amount of time or resource to do anything. You may be on very short budgets. You need to get it done quickly and so on. So there's always compromise in terms of doing design. So my first question would be, can that feed into imposter syndrome? And the second, on the flip side of that, also as designers, our job largely is to admit that we don't know the answer, and we're on this kind of journey of discovery, of iteration, of research to find out what we do. So is that actually a foundation on which we can place imposter syndrome and frame it in terms of, we don't know the answers, we're here to find out, and this kind of journey of exploration?
That's an awesome way of thinking about it. Yeah, that's really great. I do think it's very interesting that both in my survey and in the poll that we just did, by far the most common imposter type to the perfectionist and the expert, when, yeah, exactly as you're saying, the constraints that we're working on mean that we're admitting we don't know things, mean that we're having to compromise, and we can never make anything perfect. There's no such thing as perfect. So how come people with that type of mindset are attracted to this type of field? I don't know. It's fascinating. But yeah, I think there is a difference between embracing the discovery phase of design, where you don't know and you're building your knowledge, with having confidence in yourself to do that, and the techniques and methods that you're going to use to do that. So there's probably the separation between the work itself and the way you do the work. Mm-hmm. So you can feel like an imposter in the way in which I am working to show that I don't know anything. I'm doing that wrong. Yeah, there's layers and layers to it, but yeah, I love that way of thinking about it.
Okay, brilliant. Well, we'll draw to a close there, but thanks ever so much, Kat. That's fantastic stuff. And we're going to have a break now. Time for some lunch. We're going to start again at 2:00 with Tom Ridley. So look forward to seeing you all then. Thanks very much.